So let's begin. Our first presenter is Dr. Sherry Stewart. Sherry has made significant internationally reputed contributions to the understanding of and intervention with anxiety and addictions. She has relentlessly pursued identifying the basic personality, motivational, and situational factors underlying the proclivity to develop excessive anxiety and/or addictive behaviors, such as misuse of cigarettes, alcohol, cannabis, prescription drugs, gambling, and using sophisticated social science lab, field, and intervention approaches. Her work has extended into Aboriginal communities. Dr. Stewart.
I had heard that I would be able to see the slides down here, but there they are. That's wonderful. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about some of the work that we did during the pandemic. So what I'm going to speak about today is a particular stressor that many individuals faced during the pandemic, which is mandatory homeschooling. So when the schools were closed, the new role that was put on many parents to manage their children's education, or at least make sure that they were in front of their computer screens getting their classwork done. And so I'm going to be talking about the implications for couples' distress, conflict, and substance use during the pandemic. So I'm going to be talking about 3 studies, all with the same data set. So one concerns homeschooling and substance use motivations. The second is around homeschooling and alcohol use and some gender differences that we saw within our couples. And finally, we'll be looking at homeschooling and its impact on romantic conflict. Now, just some background. As you know, we've heard over and over again, the COVID pandemic led to some real increases in mental health issues, increases in anxiety, depression, and at least for some individuals, there was increases in alcohol and cannabis use. But that tells us mostly about what was happening at the individual level, what was happening within romantic couples. And it was quite a unique situation because during lockdown or during, regulations to stay-at-home orders and so on, there were extended periods that couples were spending together in the home with little ability to socialize with other people other than the couple themselves. And there is some evidence suggesting that the couples that were experiencing more COVID-related stress were also experiencing more conflict within their relationships. We also saw some increases in more extreme forms of conflict, like intimate partner violence during that time. And we have to think about some of the unique stressors that people were experiencing during that time of lockdown. And one of them is what I'm calling homeschooling, which we're really talking about mandatory home-based learning. And so this represented new roles for parents that they weren't used to or ready for, and that we know that new roles can exacerbate conflict between work and family outside of the pandemic, so you can imagine that should also be having an impact within the pandemic. We also know that parents were reporting more mental health concerns and more increases in their alcohol use than non-parents during the pandemic, and we wondered how much of that could we really be attributing to this new role of being teachers during the mandatory homeschooling. So we addressed this question of what are the impacts of mandatory homeschooling in a set of studies that were all with the same data collection. So we had 750 romantic partners cohabitating. They were all Canadians, so 15, 16 individuals all together. They completed a survey online in June 2020, and their time frame of reference was that first month of the pandemic, so April 2020, so very early phase of the pandemic. 211 of those couples were homeschooling at least one child. So we had them complete measures around their mental health, anxiety, depression, optimism, role strain, that is, conflict between their work and their family life. And then COVID-related stressors, the stressors that were more specific to the COVID pandemic. We had them report on their dyadic conflict with their partner, both what they were enacting towards their partner and what they were receiving from their partner. We asked them about their alcohol use, their frequency, quantity, and their peak drinking, as well as their motivations for alcohol use if they were using alcohol, and cannabis if they were using cannabis, to look at coping-related use. Now, our first study that I want to talk about within that data set is homeschooling effects on coping-motivated substance use. So we did some between-group analyses where we compared the individuals who were homeschooling with couples who were not homeschooling, and we showed the homeschooling couples had decreased optimism, increased role strain, and increased cannabis use and alcohol use to cope. Our second study that I wanted to tell you about was gender differences in homeschooling's effects on drinking behavior. So here we operationalized, so we're looking within the homeschooling couples, and we operationalized homeschooling continuously by how much time an individual was putting into homeschooling. And we saw that the more time they were putting into homeschooling, the more that they were experiencing anxiety, the more that they were experiencing depression, the more they were experiencing traumatic stress and socioeconomic stress, but the more their partner was drinking. So that was quite interesting. But when we looked at drinking, when we broke it down by gender, we found some very interesting effects. So the more a mother was spending time homeschooling, the more she was drinking and the more her partner was drinking. The more a father was spending time homeschooling, the less the mother was drinking. So, and we also know that the women were putting in more time homeschooling. So if there was a bit more of an egalitarian split where the men were putting in more time, this seemed to have protective effects for the mother in terms of her drinking behavior. Now we'll move into homeschooling and romantic conflict. So here we start off with the between-group analyses. So we did find that those who were engaging in homeschooling were enacting more conflict towards their partners than couples that weren't engaged in homeschooling. But that was only true if we just looked at the individuals who were mandatorily homeschooling. So if we took out the small number of parents who were voluntarily homeschooling, they'd been doing that before the pandemic. So we took them out, then we saw this group difference in conflict enactment. We also saw that the more time that an individual was spending homeschooling, the more that they were enacting conflict towards their partner, and the more their partner said that they were enacting conflict towards them, the more they were receiving conflict. So we see this kind of spillover effect from the work domain, the work of being a homeschooling parent, right, to the area of the romantic domain. We don't seem to see crossover effects. Like if an individual is homeschooling more, their partner wasn't enacting more conflict on them. It was the homeschooling partner that's enacting the conflict, and the couple members are agreeing about that. So overall, what does all of this mean? So parents seem to have difficulty managing the increased demands of homeschooling during that early phase of the pandemic. And pandemic-related distress we found in our previous research was more strongly related to drinking for women, and we seem to see that again here with homeschooling stress. It does seem that more equitable division of labor between men and women in terms of the homeschooling labor might have protective effects on alcohol use for women, and also that the frustrations of mandatory homeschooling seem to be manifesting as conflict enactment towards one's partner, at least under these contexts, the context of where it's difficult to escape from the partner during this lockdown period. Now, of course, there's lots of limitations. It was a cross-sectional design, so I'm talking about it as if mandatory homeschooling is causing these effects, but we don't know for sure from that data. It's retrospective. They were thinking back to what happened in April 2020, and there may be some memory effects going on. There were differences between our homeschooling and non-homeschooling partners. I didn't mention that, but age differences were controlled in our analyses, but we didn't match our groups. And we can only really speak to the early phases of the pandemic because that's when the data was focused. We did a later SSHRC-funded PEG project that looked at the effects on kids and also overcame all of those limitations, and we're getting into the analyses of those data now. So what are the implications? It suggests that we have to really carefully weigh the pros and cons of school closures, and our data really does speak to recommendations that have been made that schools should be the last to close under circumstances like a pandemic, like a global pandemic. We need to provide more educational supports. There were more educational supports provided to parents over time, but we have to be prepared for these kind of situations to provide those educational and psychological supports for parents. And it seems, in particular, women may need those supports, in particular. And the importance of considering gender dyadic effects, not just the individual effects, and not, forgetting about gender, and that we need to be thinking about interventions at the couple level rather than just at the individual level. And I want to acknowledge the colleagues that were involved in this work, the students, our funders, and then just end off with a little joke and a thank you and see if there are any questions.